Welcome to the Foreign Press Center's virtual briefing with David Levine for an overview on election security. My name is Jean Fischetti, and I'm today's moderator. Participants in today's briefing include both journalists based overseas who are part of the FPC's virtual elections tour and correspondents in the US who are credentialed with the Foreign Press Center. Welcome, everyone. Just a few logistics before we get started. If the Zoom session fails or disconnects, please rejoin or dial in using the phone number provided in the registration link. This briefing is on the record, and the contents of this program will be recorded and made available to participants after its conclusion. Participation in this briefing implies your consent to being recorded. We will post a video of the recording of the briefing on the Canvas platform within 1 hour for our overseas participants and post the written transcript within 24 hours. For our FPC members based in the United States, we will email you the video and transcript. Just to note, the views expressed by the briefers are their own and do not necessarily reflect those of the Department of State or the US government. Participation of briefers in this program does not imply endorsement, approval, or recommendation of their views. And now to introduce our briefer, Mr. Levine. He is an Elections Integrity Fellow at the Alliance for Securing Democracy, which is a bipartisan initiative of the German Marshall Fund of the United States. They bring together experts on disinformation, malign finance, emerging technologies, election integrity, economic coercion, and cybersecurity, as well as regional experts to support election security. They aim to support democratic values by bringing attention to tactics used to attempt to undermine and interfere with democratic institutions, and in turn strengthen the resilience of democracies. Today, Mr. Levine will discuss recent examples of attempts by foreign entities to influence elections and the security measures that have been implemented to combat them. He will also review recent election security issues in the United States that have been addressed to ensure a free and fair electoral process, from the primaries to the national elections. This issue is certainly one that is a shared concern around the world, and we are pleased to welcome Mr. Levine here today to share his views on this subject. So, Mr. Levine will make his opening statements, and then I will return and open it up for Q&A. And with that, Mr. Levine, turning it over to you.
Jean, thanks so much for that. And thank you to the Foreign Press Center and the State Department for this opportunity. I'm thrilled to be here today to give this 2020 election security briefing. Do we have are the slides up? We'll go to the first one here. So just, Jean covered this very well, so we can go to that first slide. Let me say that for anyone on this call who still wonders whether foreign adversaries are trying to interfere in the United States' 2020 presidential election, the answer is clear: yes. Right, on September 10th, Microsoft reported that it was seeing increasing cyber attacks originating in Russia, China, and Iran, targeting its customers, including attacks against political groups and the presidential campaigns of President Trump and former Vice President Joe Biden. And in a blog post, Microsoft detailed efforts by 3 major foreign hacking groups to target the campaigns, along with other political organizations, individuals, and think tanks, including the one I work for, right? The German Marshall Fund of the United States, of which ASD is a part. And while the targets of these attacks were not election officials, Microsoft warned that the attacks were concerning for the whole ecosystem and made clear that foreign activity groups were stepping up their efforts to target the 2020 election, a sentiment consistent with US Department of Homeland Security communications on election security threats, including its recently published Homeland Threat Assessment. Right? The warning from Microsoft is a reminder that our election systems must be resilient against unforeseen problems that are likely to arise during the 2020 presidential election. Next slide. Before I get into how elections are being secured from such threats for the 2020 election, let me step back and take a minute or two to discuss how US elections are administered. Knowledge I've accrued in part based on my previous experiences as a state and local election official. right? Unlike many other countries, the administration of elections in the US is highly decentralized. Elections are primarily administered by thousands of state and local systems rather than a single unified national system. At the federal level, Congress has authority to regulate elections, which derives from various legal resources depending on the type of election. And Congress has passed legislation in major functional areas of the voting process, such as voter registration and prohibitions against discrimination. It has also periodically authorized appropriations or appropriated funds to help states upgrade voting equipment and strengthen election security. Additionally, federal agencies such as the Department of Homeland Security and the Federal Bureau of Investigations, DHS and FBI respectively, offer states assistance such as consultations and investigations on election security issues. Right, in 2016, following the US 2016 presidential election, the Department of Homeland Security provided a critical infrastructure designation for US election infrastructure, which permits the Department of Homeland Security to prioritize support for state and local election jurisdictions. And this includes information sharing on threats, monitoring election systems, conducting vulnerability assessments, and providing assistance on identifying or responding to threats. Next slide. That said, right, the role for state and federal elections resides primarily with each state, and no state administers elections in exactly the same way as another state. States regulate many aspects of elections, including the process to register to vote, right? The process with regards to mail balloting, as well as early voting requirements, right? Which is, of course, the process of voting in person on election day before November 3rd in this case, which many but not all states have, as well as, of course, election day procedures. Next slide. Within each state, responsibility for managing, planning and conducting elections is largely a local process with over 8,000 local election jurisdictions nationwide. Some states have mandated election administration guidelines and procedures for the conduct of elections, whereas other states have guidelines that give generally local jurisdictions considerable autonomy and discretion in the way they administer elections. The result is that elections could be administered differently across states and local jurisdictions. Some of the things that local election officials commonly do is registering eligible voters, educating voters on how to use voting technology, providing information on the candidates and ballot measures that would be on their ballots, recruiting, training, and mobilizing, right, the workers that would be working at the polling places on election day, as well as preparing and testing the voting equipment and counting the ballots that are used within the localities in their states. Next slide. The election process here in the United States is composed primarily of pre-election, election, and post-election activities. Just real briefly, pre-election activities include things such as providing opportunities for eligible individuals to register to vote, recruiting and training workers who assist voters with regards to their ability to vote, and of course, testing voting equipment. Election day activities include things such as closing and opening polling places, checking in voters and verifying that they're eligible to vote when they come vote, and providing opportunities for voters to cast and mark their ballots. And post-election activities include things such as securing the voting equipment and the ballots once the polls have closed, publishing unofficial results on election night, certifying the official election results, and of course, performing things such as recounts if required. I just want to make a brief note about post-election activities. Right? There was a September 22nd, 2020 public service announcement from the FBI and the Department of Homeland Security that noted an awareness that foreign adversaries could attempt to spread disinformation regarding the results of the 2020 elections in an effort to discredit the electoral process and undermine US democratic institutions. So I'll make just a couple points about this process for clarity purposes. Number one, state and local officials typically require several days to weeks to certify election final results in order to ensure that every legally cast vote is accurately counted. The increased use of mail ballots due to COVID-19 protocols, right, coronavirus pandemic, could leave officials with incomplete results on election night, and that's okay. Certainly isn't evidence of nefarious conduct. However, foreign actors could exploit the time required to certify and announce election results by sharing information that includes reports of voter suppression, cyber attacks targeting election infrastructure, election fraud, and other problems with the intent to convince the public of the election's legitimacy or illegitimacy. Next slide. Just briefly, the election infrastructure, right, or the election process relies on various assets, right? And those things include things such as information technology systems, networks, equipment, and facilities. And these assets can broadly be characterized as physical, cyber, and human components of the election infrastructure. Physical components are things such as equipment, materials, and facilities that provide protection for election activities. An example would be voting equipment. Cyber components are hardware and software, which include things such as computers, servers, databases, and other IT or information technology systems used in election activities. And then human components are things such as personnel who have unique training, knowledge, skills, and authorities whose roles or absence could frankly hinder election activities. And one great example, of course, is state and local election officials. In my role as the Elections Integrity Fellow at ASD, I'm regularly assessing the conduct of these elections and their vulnerabilities, assessing them with regards to electoral infrastructure, administration, and policies, and trying to come up with recommendations and work with the partners to raise awareness on threats and recommend mitigation measures that try and help ensure that any vulnerabilities that do exist can be mitigated accordingly. The broad point I want to make, and I'll go into a little more detail about it, is at this juncture, voters should feel confident that safeguards are in place to protect their votes from cyber attacks and technical problems that could arise for the November 2020 presidential election. That said, there are still some opportunities for states to make their systems even more robust between now and November, right? And since the 2020 presidential election, including the last few months, there's been substantial progress made to implement the kind of backup and security features that should allow all voters to cast ballots that will be counted, even in the event of a successful cyber attack or other unforeseen system failure. All right, what I'll briefly touch on are some important steps that states have taken to ensure that voters can cast ballots even if problems arise. Next slide. One of those steps that states have taken is to ensure that there will be a paper record of nearly every vote for 2020. Voters in the past, there were some voters that previously voted on paperless voting machines, and there will be very few of them this go around. The director for the cyber division of the Department of Homeland Security recently estimated that 92% of voters will vote on paper ballots that can be audited. And even in jurisdictions that use paperless machines, an increased demand for mail-in voting, due in part because of the coronavirus, will likely lead to even more voters voting on a paper ballot. And it's also worth noting that voters that are not using paperless voting machines are not in what we call tipping point states, or any of the states most likely to determine control of the US Senate. And when I say tipping point states, I'm talking about states that would give a winning candidate, right, a winning presidential candidate, a majority of the electoral votes, or frankly, I'm also talking about those states that may play a role in the outcome with regards to control of the US Senate. Next slide. Our election system is also more resilient because a large number, right, even though many voters, and there'll be a record number that vote by mail this election, there are also going to be a large number that are expected to vote in person. And election officials have taken a number of steps to ensure that in-person voting will not be stopped, even in the event of cyber attacks, election technology malfunctions, or other disruptions. One example is that there's more early in-person voting than there's ever been. And that's really important because if there's more voting spread over more days and locations and more times, that helps ensure that an attack against or failure in the infrastructure on any particular day is less likely to disenfranchise large numbers of voters. If there's a problem during early voting, voters might be able to opt to come back later. And of course, the more folks who vote early, the fewer voters that might be affected or would be affected by an election day disruption. Additionally, more states and localities have backup paper poll books. there's an increasing number of jurisdictions and states in the United States that have what are called electronic poll books, which are laptops or computers the poll workers are using instead of paper lists to look up voters. And those can help process voters more quickly. But in the event that those e-poll books or electronic poll books become inoperable, what we've seen is that the vast majority of states, including those tipping point states, have a backup paper process so that voting can continue uninterrupted, even if those electronic poll books go down. If voting machines were to go down, we see the vast majority of states, including tipping point states, having backup or emergency paper ballots in place so that, again, we can have a situation where voters can continue to cast ballots in an uninterrupted manner, and the likelihood of there being delays if electronic voting systems go down, again, is smaller. Next slide. And I think, another thing that's worth noting, right, is that we've seen mail ballot improvements that have taken place across the country as well. One of the things I think that's really important is, even in spite of some issues that have been reported regarding the United States Postal Service, we've seen a number of states that have implemented online ballot request portals. And those, frankly, are really important because they allow voters to request, right? They allow voters to request ballots, which frankly gets the post office out of the first step of that process. What it in fact allows, right, folks to do is, instead of voters having to make a request by mail, right, to get a mail-in ballot, they instead do that electronically, and that cuts down the amount of time it takes to vote a mail-in ballot. Additionally, more and more states have ballot tracking tools which allow voters to be able to track where their mail ballot process is, right, with regards to the USPS system. And that's really important because that allows voters to confirm if their ballot has been sent out to them, if in fact it's been accepted or been received by election officials, and then whether it's subsequently been accepted. And that helps inform them as to whether or not they may have to go vote in person on election day. And then finally, we're seeing more and more options that are being provided to voters on how to, right, be able to submit those mail ballots. Right? Mail ballots don't necessarily have to be submitted simply by sending your ballot back into the mail. In many states, for example, we're seeing drop boxes enacted that allow voters to go and put their ballot in a secure box that election officials have security around, and they can simply take and then subsequently tabulate. Next slide. What more can be done between now and election day? Right? I'm just going to briefly touch on these things because I know we're running really short on time. One of the things I think that's really important is educating more voters, or educating voters. One of the things that I think is really important is that there's been a certain amount of, and it remains a concern, right, mis and disinformation that's been put out, right, into the information sphere. Disinformation, of course, is the deliberate use of false or misleading information, right? Misinformation is the use of false or misleading information, but that it doesn't necessarily have the purposeful intent, right, behind it. And I think, one of the things that's really important is that election officials and other trusted sources of information need to be engaged in what's called a pre-bunking process, or a proactive flooding of accurate information about the election process, so that voters have accurate, timely information about how elections are in fact being conducted between now and election day. One good example of that is with regards to mail-in voting. Of all the election misinformation this year, false and misleading information about voting by mail has been among the most rampant. According to Signal Labs and Media Insights Company, right, of the 13.4 million mentions of voting by mail between January and September of 2020, nearly a quarter of them were misinformation or appeared to be. And this, of course, is a concern because there's been there are more voters that are expected to vote by mail than ever before. And of course, there's also been a recent uptick in Russian disinformation with regards to this. And so I just want to make a couple really important points with regards to the mail-in voting process. Number one, there have been countless independent studies and government reviews done that have found voter fraud to be extremely rare in all forms, including mail-in voting. Number two, in terms of security, mail-in ballots are paper ballots that are hand-marked by the voter, and that's considered the gold standard of election security because that allows voters to verify their choices. And of course, it allows election officials on the back end to be able to verify the validity of the election results, which can increase public confidence in the outcome. And finally, the vast majority of states have a number of protocols and checks and balances in place to ensure that mail-in voting is secure. Those include signature verification protocols, right, to ensure that the signature election officials have on file matches what's on the mail-in ballot that's been submitted to their offices. And there are a number of other checks and balances that exist as well. I think just really quickly, as I mentioned before, a couple of the things that election officials are continuing to do that I think are really important, again, are making sure that they've got more paper backup processes that are in place in case election technology goes down. Very quickly, making sure that they've got backup paper poll books in case their electronic poll books go down, making sure they have adequate backup paper ballots in case their voting machines go down, and making sure that in the event eligibility cannot be ascertained at the polling place, there are provisional ballots on hand that election officials can provide them so that after the election officials can ascertain and verify that in fact the voter was eligible and that their ballot should be counted. And then finally, of course, election officials can continue to do things with regards to securing and testing their voting systems between now and election day. That includes making sure that their passwords are secure and strong, and also making sure that their contingency systems, their resiliency plans are in place so that if there are any disruptions that occur between now and election day, they know what to do and how to do it in a timely manner. I look forward to folks' questions.
Great, thank you so much. We'll go to our questions now, and I just remind everybody, if you have a question, please type it in the Q&A and be sure to include your country and outlet there as well. Our first question we're going to take is from Leena Chandran from Malayala Manorama in India. And Leena asked about that ballots and voters' confidence. She said, are the ballots scanned to ensure their accuracy at the time of voting? And also, can you speak about the level of voter confidence when it comes to cybersecurity?
Sure. Jean, could you repeat that first part of the question?
Sure. The first part was regarding ballots. So are they scanned to ensure their accuracy so there's no fraud on the actual ballot?
Sure. No, those are two terrific questions. I'll take the first one. So the vast majority of jurisdictions in the United States use what's called an optical scanner, and they are scanning those ballots. And I think that's an important thing for a couple of reasons. Number one, there's a lot of literature that suggests that having a scanning system in fact helps ensure the accuracy of the tabulation of the votes on election night. It also helps ensure that votes, the unofficial results, can be tabulated in a quick manner. But the flip side of that, of course, is that by using a scanner, as the vast majority of jurisdictions do, we, of course, have the paper records or the paper receipts that we can audit after election day to be able to verify that, in fact, the results are accurate. So if there are any issues with those scanners, right, we're able to catch those issues on the back end. The second question is with regards to confidence in cybersecurity. I think that a number of steps have been taken to ensure that we are in a pretty good place with regards to cybersecurity for the 2020 elections. Obviously I think a lot of folks on this call are aware of some of what took place in 2016. And we know that there were efforts to breach certain parts of the election infrastructure. Right? We know that in some cases, right, there were voter registration systems that were had the ability to be modified. Right, voter registration could have been potentially modified in at least one state, and that was outlined in the bipartisan Senate Intelligence Committee report. I think since 2016, a number of steps have been taken. Number one, we've seen the federal government play a much larger role in helping support states and local election officials. With Department of Homeland Security at the lead, we saw that election infrastructure was designated as critical, and we've seen the Department of Homeland Security, along with other partners, provide a whole host of resources to help ensure that state and local election officials are even more secure with regards to election systems this time around. And that includes a number of things. One, state and local election officials have received much more cybersecurity training. Two, there's much more going on in terms of threat sharing between state and local election officials, as well as federal authorities. And three, there's much more scanning of internet-facing systems being done to help ensure that any vulnerabilities that exist can be identified and mitigated. And so, I feel that, you can never say with 100% certainty that, right, your election systems are completely secure. But I believe that the steps that have been taken can help ensure, number one, that our election systems are in a good place in terms of preventing attacks. Number two, they're in a good place in terms of detecting potential attacks. And number three, they're in a good place with regards to recovering. And when you look at prevention, detection, and recovery, those three things taken together are all about election resiliency. And so I think the question that folks ought to be thinking about is not necessarily whether or not you can 100% prevent an attack from a foreign adversary, but whether or not you've got the necessary resiliency to be able to do so. And that, again, very briefly underscores the importance of the fact that the vast majority of votes will be on paper-based voting systems, as well as the fact that an increasing number of election jurisdictions have post-election audits that will help validate those election outcomes and help ensure that any issues with our election technology can be identified on the back end.
Great, thank you. Our next question is from Yvonne Valdez from Mexico. And Yvonne asks, how or to whom can voters report to if they suspect their vote is not being secured appropriately? And then what would be the next steps to take after such a complaint?
Yvonne, that's a wonderful question. I think it's, number one, I would encourage, right, folks as a broader manner when they have questions with regards to the elections. I would always encourage them to look out for trusted sources of information. And that starts almost every time with their state and local election officials. As I sort of outlined at the beginning of this session, right, there are local election officials in over 8,000 jurisdictions that do the nuts and bolts of running elections. And if people have questions about the election process, including Yvonne's question, I think the first place to go to is your local election official. If you still have questions with regards to issues such as the one Yvonne raised, I would suggest, right, raising them with the state election official, right? It is states that are the folks that are primarily responsible, right, for setting the guidelines, right, and regulations regarding how elections are conducted in their particular state. And if on the off chance, and I do mean the off chance, that you're still not getting where you need to go with local or state election officials, I think there are third-party organizations, right, that you can be able to reach out to, right, who again are monitoring and staying closely abreast of these kinds of issues, right? And those include entities, for example, such as the League of Women Voters, right, who I think are really helpful on this front too. But I want to sort of underscore that it's state and local election officials that are really the primary sources for this information, who you ought to be reaching out to. And state and local election officials are happy, right, in almost all instances, to be able to hear your question, right, walk you through what processes, right, and checks and balances exist in order to sort of mitigate the issues that are being raised, and explain to you what can be done to try and resolve that issue. And the earlier those issues can be raised, the more options, right, that exist in order to be able to resolve your issue in a timely manner. So if there are issues that are like the one Yvonne raised, I would encourage folks to reach out to your local election official and do so as quickly as possible, so that that issue can be resolved as quickly as possible.
Thank you. Our next question comes from the Canvas board, which is from Maria Laura Carbonetta from Talam News Agency in Argentina. And she asks, are there any, it's about accusations by the president regarding possible fraud and manipulation through mail-in voting. And then she asks, are there any concrete examples of this kind of fraud in the past in the United States?
Yeah, I think that's a a wonderful question. Look, there are two pieces to this, right? Number one, as I sort of mentioned at the outset, fraud, right, in our elections. I think there's been, numbers of studies that have been done, right, on this, both in government as well as in the research community that indicate that fraud is rare, right? A sentiment that's been echoed by the FBI director, a number of other election officials, as well as state and local election officials throughout the country. And I think the research bears that out. Doesn't mean that I want to be clear. It doesn't mean that it's not impossible, but there are a number of reasons why that's largely the case. And first and foremost, that's because state election and local election officials have a number of checks and balances, right, in place to help ensure, right, that there aren't those kinds of issues. And I touched a bit on them before. One of those things is, in many cases, right, whether you are submitting a ballot by mail or you're going to vote in person on election day, right, voters often have to sign in or provide their signature, and election officials, of course, have the ability to compare that signature with their ballot to the one that they already have on file when they registered to vote. And if there's that discrepancy, state and local officials, and I can attest to this having been one formerly, are very good at being able to follow up, right, and collaborate with prosecutors on being able to sort of go and take subsequent action to address those issues. And of course, in many instances, if someone is going to try and engage in that kind of behavior, I think it's worth underscoring that the likelihood that they're going to impact the outcome of the election is very small, and that the penalties can be very significant, right? Further underscoring the rareness of fraud in our elections. The second point that I think is important, and I think I'll try and address this briefly, is that the 2020 election, right, we've witnessed, and I touched on this at the outset, we have witnessed foreign interference efforts, right, by folks such as Russia, which the intelligence community has highlighted and warned against. And meanwhile, right, we know that there are some domestic players that have tried to undermine perceptions of the integrity of the election. And of course, when that happens, that can play into authoritarian hands and threaten to discredit democracy. And so, it's really important that, folks, right, trusted sources of information, as well as people that large segments of the population look up to, are providing timely, accurate information about the election process. Because if they don't, that's the kind of information, right, that can be amplified by bad actors and adversaries to sow discord and confusion and chaos and undermine confidence in the election process. And that's not just my statement, right? Bill Evanina, right, who's of course one of the quarterback, right, of US intelligence efforts, made just the same comment earlier this morning.
Great, thank you. For our next question, we'll take one from the phone, a live question.
Yes, the next question will be from Santo Vilola. Santo, your microphone is on. Santo Vilola. Okay. Let's go then to the next person on the list. Nikila Natarjan. And I apologize, I'm sure I'm mispronouncing these names. Nikila Natarjan, your microphone is on.
Hi, can you hear me?
I can, Nikila.
Thank you. Thanks so much. One data point stood out for me when you were speaking, and you said 92% can be traced back to a paper trail. That's remarkable. So what's really up in the air? Is it just the 8%?
It's an excellent question. So, I think, one thing I think that's really important, I think it's a tough question to answer. I mean, I think one of the things that this is sort of important about is that this reflects the fact that our system right now is pretty resilient, right? One of the things I touched on at the very end were some things that if states, right, had time and resources, they could try and do, right? And so one example of that, to be honest, might be many states and localities are doing post-election audits to validate results. And if there's an ability to make those audits a little more robust, in other words, if they're going to be auditing a few precincts and they could audit a couple more, right, that would be helpful in potentially helping further validate the election results. But I think to your question, what this really tells me is that with regards to the security of our elections, right? Voters ought to be pretty confident, right, that when they cast a ballot, that it will count. And I think that really speaks to the efforts that state and local election officials, in conjunction with their partners, including federal officials, vendors, and others, have taken to help ensure, right, the security of the election infrastructure. So for me, your question is really important, because I think what it does is it indicates that our election system right now today is pretty resilient. And I think that's really important, because it helps, right, buttress the confidence that folks ought to have, right, in the fact that if you vote, your vote will count, and that we can ascertain that the winners are the winners and the losers are the losers post-election.
Great, thank you. Our next question comes from Emily Marcano from El Nacional in Venezuela. Emily's question is regarding mail-in ballots. How to ensure all the mail-in ballots are counted by the local poll workers. And if there's some issue with an actual vote, are voters notified if there's a mistake on their ballot that they could possibly correct?
Yeah, those are two terrific questions. So in many states, and not all, but an increasing number of states, right, we're seeing voters that are being notified not only when their ballot's being received, but in fact, when it's being counted, right, number one. Number two, we see an increasing number of states, right, that post-election, this is really important, right, I'll just say this, on election night, right, what will be disseminated or shared by the media are going to be unofficial election results, right? Those will be results in many cases that are a sample of the actual number of ballots cast, combined potentially with some, right, what we would sort of call, right, basically some polling, exit polling, and that in some cases, right, is enough to potentially ensure the outcome in terms of who won and who lost. But following election day and in the days and weeks ahead, election officials will be validating all of the unofficial results, and in some states may in fact even be receiving additional ballots. And that's because in some states, right, they accept additional ballots that come through the mail that are postmarked on or before election day. And so, number one, voters in many cases have the ability to, through a ballot tracking system, see and be notified when their ballot's been cast and counted. Number two, election officials have post-election validation processes that are often observable, right, to the media and members of the public, so that members of the public, media, and others can actually see the process in place and feel confident, right, that in fact the votes that were cast are being counted and are reflected in the final outcome itself.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Jackie Fox of Irish National Broadcaster RTE. And Jackie asks, what kind of techniques are being used to suppress votes in the US, and what can be done to stop it?
Sure. Now, Jackie, so the Alliance for Securing Democracy primarily focuses, right, on and takes a look at, right, those kinds of issues, but with respect to foreign interference. And one example of this that we've seen is that we saw disinformation efforts by foreign adversaries, such as Russia, right, that occurred in the run-up to the 2016 presidential election, that, for example, targeted African-American voters and either, in some instances, tried to persuade them to not vote, or in some cases, potentially tried to persuade them to vote maybe for voters other than whom they initially wanted to support. And as the intelligence and law enforcement communities have put out over the past 4 years plus, right, those sorts of attacks and those kinds of influence campaigns continue. And they continue, and they come in many forms, right? In addition, of course, to sort of these foreign influence threats, right, which of course are targeted at certain groups of voters. We've also seen these kinds of efforts take place with regards to the pandemic. We know that because of the pandemic, and this is not something unique to the United States, but worldwide, we know that as the pandemic has sort of evolved, right, that in many cases, even public health experts aren't necessarily certain in some cases what measures, right, absolutely need to be taken to mitigate the risks. And in those cases, in those instances, right, there are information voids that we've seen adversaries, including Russia, China, and Iran, right, try and exploit, right? Exploit to, try and sow confusion and chaos, right? So discord and try and undermine confidence in our election processes. And so, one of the things that ASD is continuing to monitor is whether or not, right, adversaries will try and use things, right, including influence campaigns, right, to try and spread mis and disinformation to facilitate or enable voters to not turn out, right, to vote on election day. And of course, voters are the last line of defense with regards to the 2020 election. And it's really critical that they turn out and vote, right? If we had complete voter turnout, right, that would go awfully long ways to mitigating any kind of foreign interference threats.
Thank you. Bit of a follow-up to that question comes from Pearl Matibe from Open Parliament in Zimbabwe. And Pearl asked if you could share an example of an incident of foreign interference with a country's election. So there has to be specific to the United States, but any example of foreign interference in a country's national election.
No, absolutely. I think one example that we are keenly aware of that I think is worth noting is in 2014, right, we saw a three-pronged attack, right, that was carried out, right, with Russian affiliated hackers, right, on Ukraine's presidential election. And we saw a situation where, this is something that, again, Bill Evanina, right, U.S. intelligence official, right, briefly alluded to. We saw a situation, again, where Russian TV, right, tried to indicate that a candidate, and in fact, won that election when in fact that wasn't the case. And so, we've seen efforts by foreign entities to interfere in that election. We saw efforts in the U.S. in the 2016, right, U.S. presidential election. We also saw efforts, for example, in France's 2017 election, where again, we saw efforts to interfere in President Macron's campaign. So there very much, is an effort by certain foreign actors to interfere in democratic elections, and that's gone back a number of years.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Martin Burchardt from the Danish Daily Information. And Martin asks, which states do you recommend we keep an eye out for on the days after the election when it comes to late results because of mail-in votes? And a question on the validity of the ballots from those states.
Yeah, it's a great question for Martin. I would encourage folks to look at a few things just broadly before I zero in on the state. Number one, which states allow for pre-processing of mail ballots before election day? And when I say that, I mean there's a process that most states have, which is when mail ballots are submitted, you can basically line up your mail ballots to be ready to be tabulated, right, before election day. So that means, in essence, that you can, right, election officials have the ability to flatten out the ballots, take them out of the envelopes, put them in a secure location, and then when election day rolls around, they're ready to be put into high-speed scanners to tabulate them. An increasing number of states, right, are now getting, right, more time in advance of election day to be able to basically arrange their ballots to be processed so that, in fact, right, they'll be able to have many of those ballots tabulated and counted on election night. But there are states where that, right, continues to, be a bit of an issue, right? Examples of that are, right, Pennsylvania, right, which would be an example of that. And of course, I think that also could be an issue, right, again, with a state like Michigan. Michigan recently, enacted a law that allowed for a little more time to be able to pre-process, what we call pre-process those mail-in ballots, but not a lot more time before election night. And so, I think those are a couple of states, right, that are worth sort of paying attention to. I think, another thing that I think is worth noting as well is taking a look again at where states, or what dates states need to have, right, their elections certified by, right, in order for those results to obviously, go forward from there. And so, I think it's really important for folks on the call to be mindful of when you can begin processing mail-in ballots and when, in fact, election results can be certified. I think it's really important that folks should be sort of thinking about, putting out or thinking about, disseminating or publicizing the final results that are certified by the states, not necessarily those results that are coming out on election night, because there's a possibility that those results could change, right? A distinct one between election night, right, and when they're certified. And so as you're reporting on these issues, you ought to be very mindful of that. And you ought to be looking to state and local election officials, right, for cues on when, in fact, the results are at a place where you feel comfortable being able to confirm the outcomes.
Thank you. For our next question, we'll go back again to a live questioner.
Great. Jose Luis Guzman Monroy. Jose, your microphone is on. Jose Luis?
Hello, do you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Thank you very much. Well, President Trump has said many things about the email vote. What's your opinion about it? She said democracy in America is some sort of risk because he fears fraud by the email vote. What do you think particularly about this?
I'll say I appreciate the question. As I think I've sort of touched on, before, I think that mail-in voting is a secure process. We've had mail-in voting, right, in the United States since the Civil War. We've seen, right, state and local election officials, right, across the political spectrum, right, that have some form of mail-in voting, right, that exists. And we're, of course, expecting, right, a record number of voters to be able to cast ballots by mail. We see, right, again, more voters who can track their ballots through the mail system. We see election officials offering more opportunities for voters to be able to return their ballots securely, whether it's being able to return them to election offices, right, returning them to secure drop boxes, which are convenient locations throughout their jurisdiction, right, or simply being able to return them via, right, the United States Postal Service. I think it's really important, right, the trusted sources of information are proactively sharing, right, what processes are in place to ensure, right, that mail-in voting is of course safe and secure. And recently there was a video put out by folks at DHS, right, the FBI, right, as well as intelligence officials, which was a great video about 9 minutes long. And one of the things it talked about were the efforts being made to safeguard voting processes, all voting processes, including mail-in voting. And I think, whether or not the process is, in person, right, early or on election day, whether the process is by mail, right, Americans should feel confident that each of these processes are safe and secure, and that if they cast their ballots any of those ways, that those ballots will be, cast successfully and counted and reflected in the final outcome.
Great, thank you. Do you have any statistics? Gracia Ortiz asked if you have any statistics on approximately how many people choose to vote by mail.
That's a wonderful question. We know in recent elections, and I have to double back on which one to be fair, but I think in the last, it was either in the 2018 or 2016 election, we were looking at, there were about a quarter of voters that voted by mail. And the Election Assistance Commission has the data on this. We expect a much higher percentage of voters, or a higher percentage of voters to be voting by mail this upcoming election. It's a little bit anybody's guess what that might be. Earlier on in the pandemic, I think there were some folks that talked about, over half of voters, voting by mail. I think as we've gone through the pandemic, right, and as things have evolved, I think there are for a number of reasons, there are a number of voters that have maybe expressed, right, interest in potentially being able to vote in person. And, that's a few reasons. Number one, in the United States, I think we've gotten more PPE, or personal protective equipment, become more familiar with voting during the pandemic, and as a result, have a little bit of better understanding on how to vote safely and securely during the pandemic. I think also in a presidential election year, you're also going to see, a lot of people who are either first-time voters or voters who, for one reason or another, may feel more confident voting in person, right? And so, I think we'll see, I think, large numbers of voters, certainly more than ever before, voting by mail, but we're going to still see a certain number of voters, a high turnout, I expect, with regards to in person. And that underscores the importance of what I sort of spoke about before, which is about having, backup paper processes, so that if any part of the election infrastructure, any of your technology goes down, you can ensure that voters continue to vote, right, in an uninterrupted manner, right? If your electronic poll books go down, which is that place where people check in, right, then there's a paper poll book so that people can still be checked in. If you have an electronic voting system that goes down, you have additional paper ballots on hand so you can vote. And so again, I think we'll see high numbers doing both, but I certainly don't have the crystal ball to give you the exact numbers, at least for this go around.
Thank you. Our next question is from Gazmend Sila from Climb Kosovo TV in Kosovo. And Gazmend asks, do you think that Americans have entered these elections more educated than they were in 2016? Do you think they know more about fake news and the different interferences that may happen in the elections?
That's a wonderful question. I think that in some respects, I think the American public, right, I do believe is a bit more knowledgeable about the 2020 election. I think that, the American public, for example, is aware that there is a threat of foreign interference in the 2020 elections. And I think that's in fact, right, a testament to, right, efforts of state, local election officials and their partners on the front lines, including, right, vendors, including social media companies, including civil society actors and their federal partners. But one thing I think that is important to know and important to point out is that is a concern for me, is that I do think there are swaths of the American public, right, that have concerns about how our elections will be conducted that aren't compatible with, in fact, the kinds of precautionary measures and safeguards that election officials have put in place to ensure the security and integrity of our elections. And I think that's a really big piece. We at ASD, we want everyone to vote, right, regardless of who they're going to vote for. That's really important. It is the number one way, right, to be able to mitigate and counter the threat of foreign interference. And if voters have concerns about the integrity of our elections that don't reflect reality, right, there's a concern that they, among other things, may, right, decide simply not to vote, or they may be more, less likely to do so. And in this current environment, right, where we have, the pandemic that's upon us, and where there's been, I think, there have been an ongoing sort of series of updates about changes to the election process, some of which stem from lawsuits, some of which stem from the pandemic, right? Some of which stem from other things. It's important that voters are engaged. It's important that voters are reaching out and hearing the messages coming from trusted sources of information so that they can make plans, if they haven't already done so, about how to register and how to vote safely and securely for the upcoming presidential election.
Thank you. For our next question, we'll go back to a live questioner.
This goes to Pearl Matibe. Pearl, your microphone is on.
Yes, thank you. I believe my question was responded to. Thank you very much for that. I guess I can ask a follow-up question. Thank you for sharing about Macron, Ukraine, and the US. Can you tell us exactly what they're doing? I know these are instances, but what are the tactics?
Sure, we can sort of, I think the few things that are worth noting, right? One is, just briefly, and obviously I'm happy to talk about these things in more detail on Canva or after than that. One thing that we've seen is right, a hack and leak sort of email operations, right? We saw that happen in 2016 in the United States election with regards to the Democratic National Committee, right? We saw similar efforts took place with regards to President Macron's campaign, right? And I think that's something to sort of be mindful of. I think, attacks on the infrastructure of elections is also a piece of this, right? Something I touched on earlier, in the 2016 election, right? We saw Russians attempt to breach, right, some of our election infrastructure. And one example of that, of course, was the voter registration systems. And I want to underscore, right, that there's no evidence to suggest in that 2016 election that any, votes were altered, nor were the outcomes in any way modified or tallied. But we saw in at least one state, right, and this has been publicized, that, right, that voter registration data could have been altered or modified, and that can be a real concern, right? It can be a concern because if somebody goes to show up to vote on election day to check in, right, and they go to check in on an electronic poll book, and their information on that poll book is suddenly either removed or been modified, right, that could impact their eligibility to subsequently cast a ballot. And that, of course, underscores the importance of making sure that election officials, which they're doing, have backup paper poll books, right, so that they can have accurate voter registration information in case there's issues with their electronic poll books. But it also underscores the fact that election officials, certainly in the United States, have provisional ballots, right? Those are ballots voters can fill out so that election officials on the back end following the election can take a look, verify voter registration information, and then cast those ballots, presuming that the voter should have been eligible to vote. And so, we basically see them in sort of, those are sort of, I think, examples, that I alluded to of things in which foreign actors are trying to breach, right, the election infrastructure, right, that exists, whether we're talking about voter registration systems, whether we're talking about, election night reporting websites, and I touched on that briefly, with regards to the Ukraine example, or whether I'm talking about, right, emails that exist with regards to election authorities or presidential candidates. Obviously, I'm happy to sort of touch on that in sort of more detail. I'm also, obviously, the other piece of this, of course, is the disinformation component, right? Foreign influence campaigns that actors are undertaking to try and sort of sow discord and chaos and confusion and undermine voters' confidence. And that's, another thing to sort of be mindful as well. But in my role as the Elections Integrity Fellow, I focus a bit more, right, on the security of the election infrastructure, which is why I'm talking a bit more about that, a little less about, what goes on with regards to sort of the social media piece.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more question. And this one comes from Adela Saltiel from Panama City, Panama. Adela asks, President Trump has cautioned that he does not trust the results of the mail-in votes. Can you explain how exactly fraud can be done with the mail-in votes? What kind of fraud could take place with mail-in voting?
It's a good question. I've been a former, I should emphasize, I've been a former local election official prior to this job. I was the Ada County, Idaho elections director, which is where Boise is. I've been a state election official, right, in the Washington, D.C.'s Board of Elections. And I've been an election observer, a short-term and long-term observer, as well as a member of the, or supporting member of the core team for the OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. I'm hard-pressed to sort of come up with examples or a way of how to get around, how to commit what amounts to sort of mail-in voter fraud. I think it's really important to note at the outset, I'm not here to tell you that doing something like that is impossible. I'm never going to say that, and I'm always open, right, to people sort of laying out what scenarios could exist or be done, right? But I am hard pressed to come up with a way in which folks could be able to engage in that kind of sort of behavior. And I think, one of the things that's really important to touch on with regards to that is, what exactly, when somebody asks that question, and I think this is really important for folks like me, I think it's important for election officials, I think it's important for reporters as well, is what do we mean when we're talking about fraud, right? If it's about the possibility, for example, of a mail carrier, right, taking ballots that have been cast, right, and discarding them. I think one of the things that's really important that reporters and others, including myself, ought to be thinking about is what the intent is behind that kind of action, right? Is that kind of action being done with the intent, right, to make sure that people aren't able to cast a ballot? Are we talking about people making or are we talking about people that are making mistakes? Certainly, we've seen, as we've gone through the 2020 election, and I can talk more about this after this session, but where we've seen issues that have arisen or mistakes that have been made with regards to the processing the ballots, but that's a far different kind of scenario than purposeful, right, actions undertaken to ensure that votes aren't counted. Again, I'm just hard pressed to sort of lay out how that would be done.
Thank you so much, Mr. Levine, for taking the time to brief us today on such an important topic on this very busy election season. I also want to thank our participating journalists, and if you did not have an opportunity to ask a question, you can submit those questions on the Canvas discussion board. And Mr. Levine will kindly answer some of those posted questions for the next 24 hours. If you're one of our FPC members, please submit any follow-up questions to the dcfpc@state.gov email. Thank you once again for participating, and that concludes the briefing for today. Thank you again, Mr. Levine.
Thank you.
And now my colleague, Jen McAndrews, will make some program announcements. Thanks all again.
Good morning, everybody. Just a reminder that today we will be uploading our production files from North Carolina. We have 8 interviews this week, plus a selection of person on the street interviews, B-roll and still photography. Just a reminder to please view the videos using the streaming function on Dropbox and then choose which ones you decide to download. These are very large files, so if you download all 8 at once, it could cause our account to drop off. Just a reminder, we also have tomorrow at 10 a.m. our Networking Idea Lab session, where you can come to listen to your colleagues pitch ideas for collaboration. That is still available for registration, and you can submit your story ideas and collaboration pitches on the discussion board Networking Idea Lab. And finally, next week's briefings are open for registration. We have the Battleground States briefings with 2, it's a duo platform with 2 analysts on the Republican and Democratic side, Margie O'Mara and John McHenry. We also have a briefing on October 15th on polling and analytics with Doug Schwartz, the director of the Quinnipiac poll. And then finally, we have Countering Disinformation with Kathleen Jamison, a professor at the University of Pennsylvania and founder of factcheck.org. All of those briefings are open for registration, and we look forward to seeing you tomorrow for the Networking Idea Lab. Good afternoon, everybody.